Many thanks. Many thanks to the organizers for inviting me and for assembling such a great group of scholars. So thanks so much for having me here. And apologies to all of you watching if I decided to present this paper through a video. But at the time of recording this, a couple of weeks ago, I wasn't sure about the quality of the Wi-Fi connection of the place where the real me will be today. And so I thought it would be better to avoid any risk to just prepare a video and show you that. If all goes well, the real me will be watching with you this video, and so he or both of us will be able to engage with your comments and answer your questions live at the end of this session. So the paper I want to present today, it's actually concerned with reception centers for asylum seekers that were set up by the Italian government at the height of the so-called European migration crisis in 2015. And although this may seem somewhat tangential to the topic or concerned with externalization, I actually think it is not. In fact, one of the premises of the paper is that asylum reception and asylum systems more in general are an integral component of the EU border regime or the humanitarian border, if you wish. Asylum reception centers, such as the ones that we'll be talking about today, go hand in hand with military patrolling of the Mediterranean, networks of governments projected across West Africa and Central Asia. It's one same EU border regime. And so the premise of the paper is that by studying these reception centers, you can actually garner insights on the EU border regime at large and specifically on the topic of externalization. So what I do in the paper is to perform an ethnographic border regime analysis, to use Sabine Hess's expression, to study 65 extraordinary reception centers that were present in a relatively small central Italian province, Macerata, in 2017 when I started my field research, and I studied their evolution until today. In fact, until tomorrow, as I'm hoping to conduct a further bout of COVID-related field research this August. So through such analysis, I try to make 3 points in the paper. The first point is that, well, it's my firm belief that we should try to develop a shared vocabulary to talk about contemporary border transformations that goes beyond the notion of externalization or internalization as such. And a vocabulary that actually attempts to capture the many ways in which border control functions are activated away from border lines in a multiplicity of places. So what I try to do in the paper is to build upon the concepts of delocalization and itinerant scale that have been proposed by members of of the organizing committee for these panels in recent paper, and building on my own development of the conceptual distinction between border lines and border functions to try and sketch well, some ideas as to how to bring together into a shared vocabulary our common concerns. I'm not going to develop this point here, partly for reasons of time and partly because it's rather conceptual. What I will try to do is to sketch the other 2 points that I make in the paper. Points that are obviously strictly related with this foundational one that I just mentioned. So the first of these 2 points is that I think we need to broaden our understanding of externalization beyond spatial concerns. I think a lot of the literature, contemporary literature on externalization and border transformations have been very much concerned with tracing new geographies or topologies. And that has been extremely helpful for all of us concerned with these issues. I do believe that a much more refined understanding of the temporalities associated and reproduced by the border regime seems necessary if we want to pursue this kind of investigation further. In the second argument, it's also about a broadening of the concerns that are usually attached to literature or expressed by literature on borders externalization, to account for processes that go beyond migration control. So most of the literature on externalization seems to be very much concerned, and rightly so, I would say, with the dialectic between border controls and migrants, autonomous migrants, bordering tactics, to use de Genova's famous expression. And this is absolutely fine, crucial. What I try to do in the paper is to think about other border management policies and practices that are strictly related to the migrant border dialectic and yet escape any deep analytical scrutiny. In particular, I think that border management policies and practices that are associated to development processes or processes of integration made in the name of development are absolutely crucial to understand the dialectic between borders and migrants. So in the, by now, 9 minutes left of this presentation, I want to try and sketch these 2 points by reference to one estate in central Italy, an estate that has a long history and that became entangled in the EU border regime in 2013, when some of the housing units in this estate were converted into reception centers for asylum seekers. So the photo that you see here is a photo that I took of another photo that was displayed in the restaurant of the estate that you can see here. This is the main villa where the current owners, the Marquis of Luzzi, his daughter, and I believe other occupants still live today. This is an attached church. This used to be a former pig's house, and it's now a housing unit with beds and a common area that is actually used by asylum seekers. It's where Italian classes are being performed, and so on. So, as I said, look, this is a photo that I think was taken during the 60s. The original photo was taken in the 1960s. But the estate has a much longer history. I mean, the Luzzi family, the Marquis family that owns this land, come from Tuscany and decided to bought a couple of hundred of acres of land that you see here surrounding this estate in the 17th century. And while they initially used it as a hunting ground for their own pleasure, and I'm sure to feed their aristocratic kitchens, it was kind of within a few decades converted into an agricultural estate. I mean, that was in the early 18th century. And the whole area, just to be specific for those of you who are not familiar, and perhaps rightly so, with the history of Italy, I mean, the whole area was under the rule of the Vatican. It was papal states cutting across central Italy. And indeed, the area here was known as the granary of the Pope. The Pope prospered with this, and with the conversion into an agricultural estate, obviously people that tilled the land were needed. And so some sharecroppers' houses were built that you can see here. This is a photo, well, an image from Google Maps that represents that estate from above. These units, I hope you can see the cursor that I'm moving. These units are the one you saw in the photo. This is the villa and the church. This is the former granary, now restaurant. I'm interested in these little houses that surround the property, and other houses that you don't see in these pictures, which are housing units where sharecroppers used to live. I mean, these houses have a long history in and on itself, which I really don't have time to get into, but basically they've been occupied by sharecroppers until the 1970s, when sharecropping was abolished as a form of employment by the Italian government. And they were subsequently occupied by agricultural wage workers. They remained unoccupied for a large period of time throughout the 80s and certainly the beginning of the 90s. They were later converted into farm holiday places by the Marquis, taking advantage of an EU-funded regional development initiative. And they were rented not so much to tourists, but to other migrants, in fact, internal migrants from the south of Italy, to work in the nearby industries and in the expansion of the highway that was being completed around that time. What is interesting here is that by 2013, these houses, which had become again emptied after the economic crisis of 2008 hit this region, came to be reused as asylum seeker reception centers. These 4 stars that you see here are 4 units where in 2017, about 100 asylum seekers were accommodated. This is about 10% of the overall number of asylum seekers present in the province at that time. So the province, just as a brief context, was highly engaged in reception systems. I mean, if you want backside stories, I mean, the president of the largest NGO was very well connected with the main party that was in government, both in Rome, in the central government, and in the local administration. And some people say that this was one of the most significant reasons why the province had always been very much active in the reception systems. I mean, it even had a much longer story in this, going back to the arrival of people from Albania in the middle of the 90s. So the point is that not only the Marquis, on the back of sharecroppers, prospered under kings and popes and in the newly established republic, but also via public money, he was able to convert these housing units into apartments and hotels. And with more public money, he was able to pay his own costs by accommodating asylum seekers. In fact, in one of the interviews I had with the current Marquis, he was telling me how much money he was getting, and it was about 10 euros per day per person in the hotel, and about 250 euros or 200 euros per month for each of the apartments hosting 2 or 3 refugees or asylum seekers rather at the time. So throughout 2017 and 18, and in fact even prior to that, the Marquis was pocketing a nifty 6,000 euros per month just by renting out to the NGO. So the story continues. Obviously, it changes. I mean, the whole situation changes when the number of arrivals into Italy began to decrease, and also as a consequence of a violent racist episode that took place in this province. It continues even further in the COVID era, and I'll be hoping to say more about this in future occasions. But I want to stop here, and even if I run through 400 years of history in 3 or 4 minutes, I want to draw to a close and try to make these points. So the story of this estate, or the kind of story that I presented, and I present at much more length in the paper, I think is a story of development that speaks of development, of 3 forms of combined and uneven development that intersect in the rooms of this estate. It is, first of all, the story of Italy's state development and state-making projects, if you wish. The story of what Gramsci called the compromise between landed elites and industrial, commercial and industrial bourgeoisie in the north of Italy that led to the subaltern incorporation of regions in what we now call Italy into the national economy, the southern question for those of you who are interested in all of this. It is indeed the story of a family that took advantage of its own position, an aristocratic family that took advantage of its own position, regardless of the mode of production, the kind of sovereign authority of the day. A family whose lineage goes back for centuries, but whose fortunes and misfortunes are actually reproduced by the EU border regime. It is indeed a story of EU regulations and agencies, Frontex, of neoliberal governance apparatuses of surveillance. Indeed, this is also a story of asylum, the story of this state. Migration and border controls is a story that goes hand in hand with the military patrolling of the Mediterranean, with the linear distinction in search and rescue zones, quote unquote, across the Mediterranean, with the allocation mechanisms across Europe and within Italy that specify these 4 stars that you see here as destinations for asylum seekers. The point can be made even more relevant if you look at all the reception centers in the province as expressed by these stars. I mean, the presence of these reception systems, reception centers for asylum seekers here cannot be understood other than by reference to the EU border regime, Dublin regulations that confine those asylum seekers in Italy, and so on and so forth. It is, in a sense, the story of another kind of combined and uneven development, the story of the subaltern incorporation of peripheral countries, whether member states like Italy, Spain, and Greece, or in the neighborhood, quote unquote, of Europe, their subaltern integration or incorporation into the EU integration project. But there is more. I mean, this is also a story of global development. I hope you can see all these stars here as well. I mean, these stars represent the point of departure of the asylum seekers that I met in the province, of some of the asylum seekers that I met in the province. And their stories speak of other border regimes and indeed of other border management policies and practices. They speak of borders being widely open, the borders of their countries being widely open to foreign direct investment, to private corporations, or indeed to drones and military armies concerned with regime change. But also of governance institutions that kind of set up another kind of compromise or class compromise, to use Gramscian terms, between national elites in these countries and European Union. They speak, in other words, of a global border regime that is as much concerned with preempting or hampering or disrupting migration routes to Europe as it is with opening up national economies in across the world or in the global south to capital and investment and governance mechanisms. Indeed, I mean, more broadly, I would say that the story of the state that I just described is a story of exploitation and dispossession. It is the exploitation, it talks about the exploitation of sharecroppers and internal migrants that have made the fortunes of popes, kings, marquises, and indeed national industrial capital. It is the story of exploitation of asylum seekers who escaped land grabs and landmines in the places where they come from, and who, once in Macerata, continue to toil the land for 10 hours a day, for 20 to 30 euros at best per day, or who work in so-called Chinese factories for 200 and 250 euros a month. So, point being that the story of the estate that I presented so much very briefly wants to suggest that it is important to think about borders externalization, to think about the dialectic between borders and migrants that unfolds in the Mediterranean and elsewhere, as also a story of border regimes and of histories and stories that provide the condition for this EU border regime to reproduce itself on the everyday. And I'll leave it like this.